This is a train that never stops. It has traveled 430,000 kilometers so far. The long journey has turned the train into a kingdom unto itself. Inside the compartments there are not only fresh vegetable farms, there's also a vast sea life museum. Medical facilities are also available. Years ago, the Earth entered an unprecedented ice age. All life was instantly frozen to extinction in a short period of time. Only a handful of people escaped this catastrophe. They boarded a train equipped with a perpetual motion machine. They became the last survivors on Earth. The train was developed by a genius inventor, Dr. Weir. The train travels non-stop on a looped railroad track, and this never-ending train has been traveling for 17 years. But Dr. Weir, who seemed to be saving humanity, is in fact a cruel and ruthless dictator. He divided the people on the train into 3, 6, 9 classes. The closer to the front of the train, the richer they were. They were treated to delicious food every day and live a life of luxury, while the poor shriveled up in the last car. For more than 10 years, they lived on protein blocks made from cockroaches. They've been living like ants, and to add to their despair, every once in a while, the rich would come to the last car and take away a bunch of children, and the children they took never came back. In the confusion, Anglo's child was taken. He tried to resist, but what awaited him was a gruesome punishment. The thugs applied a layer of freezing liquid to Anglo's shoulders. They also hung an alarm clock around his neck. He prepared everything and put his hands outside the train. Anglo screamed at the top of his lungs, but was soon silenced. The cold temperatures of a few tens of degrees below zero instantly rendered him senseless. 7 minutes later, he was pulled back. His arm was as crisp and ringing as ceramic. The fighter shook the sledgehammer in his hand and slammed it down. Andrews was now a one-armed warrior. After the punishment was over, Mason, Will's assistant, gave a speech about the difference between a hat and a shoe to make the poor people realize their place in the world. It was a speech of nonsense. The people down there are getting impatient. It was clear she couldn't convince them. She could only persuade them through the cruelty of Anglo's punishment, to show them the consequences of resistance. But long-term oppression leads to resistance, to fight for their freedom and their rights. The poor have rioted many times in the last decade or so, but under the suppression of heavily armed soldiers, they have all failed. But fortunately, there are always people who don't want to give up. This time, a man named Chris stood up. His teacher was Gilliam, the leader of the previous riots, though his riots failed, but he managed to plant a mole in the front car. Through the information passed on by the informant, they learned that in the prison car not far ahead, a Korean named Namgung Myungsu was being held in the prison car not far ahead. He was the designer of the train's security system. Once they found him, they could open the doors to all the cars. Soon Chris began to prepare for the operation. After observing, he calculated that each door opens and closes in 5 seconds, and to get from the end car to the prison car, they'd have to go through 2 gates. That meant they had to get through in 5 seconds. This was clearly an impossible task, but there are always more solutions than problems. Chris asked his buddy M to collect barrels. If they could use them to jam the doors, they'll have more than enough time. Gillam's main concern was the guns, but Chris thought that after many riots, the soldiers have probably run out of bullets. When everything is ready, the resistance began. On this day, when the soldiers came for the roll call, Chris saw the right moment to act. As soon as the car door was opened, he walked quickly to the soldier. He put the gun to his head. Without hesitation, he pulled the trigger. The result was exactly what he expected. There were no bullets in the gun. When the poor people saw this, they used all their strength. They came at him with the barrels. Chris put a cart under the barrels. It instantly increased the speed of the onslaught. The unprepared soldiers were powerless to resist. They could only watch as they rushed through. But at that moment, a strong man blocked their way in the prison wagon. The moment of truth. Gillam called on his personal bodyguard, Gray. With a flying knife move, Gray took out the man with ease. After getting the key to the prison cell, Chris and the others successfully rescued Namgung Myungsu. After a conversation, Namgung Mingxiu agreed to help them open all the car doors, but for each door he opened, he had to get 2 chronos. Clonopin was originally an industrial waste, because it causes hallucinations when smoked, so it was used as a drug in the car. Chris immediately agreed to his terms. Then Namgung Myungsu rescued his daughter, Yuna. Yuna has an extraordinary ability to perceive. She can detect the number of enemies behind each door. She was the key to success. With the help of Namgung Mingxiu and his daughter, they soon opened the first door. The compartment was really empty. Only the objects around were scattered all over the place. It seems that the other party left in a hurry. Chris delivered 2 chronos to Namgung Myungsu and his daughter as promised. Then he opened the second door for them. This is the production wagon for protein blocks. Looking at a car full of hot protein blocks, the hungry poor people immediately started to loot them. At this moment, someone was curious and opened the lid of the furnace and screamed in terror. Chris went up to take a look. He saw thousands of giant cockroaches stirring in the oven. Then he realized the protein blocks they had been eating for 17 years were made from these cockroaches. The sight almost made Chris throw up on the spot, but in order to stabilize the troops, he didn't tell the public about it. And in this car, Gillam received another tip from an informant. The note had the word water written on it. Gillam concluded that there was a carriage with a water supply. If they could capture it, they would have a bargaining chip with Dr. Weir. Then they don't even need to go to the front of the train. After that, Nangong Myeon-soo continued to open the third door, but then Yuna suddenly sensed something strange in front of her. A large number of enemies appeared in the car that was just deserted. He immediately yelled at his father not to open the door, but it was too late, as the door was slowly opened. Hordes of masked warriors stood in the car in perfect unison. They sacrificed the blood of a fish for the axe in their hands. A fierce battle began. Luckily, both sides fought with cold weapons. The poor people didn't suffer much, as they fought to the death. The conductor suddenly shouted over the loudspeaker, "The train is crossing the Yeka Bridge." The masked warriors stopped fighting. They swung their axes and started counting down. Then they all said Happy New Year. It turns out that this bridge is the original starting point of the train. Every time a train comes through here, that's when the new year began. And that's when Mason reappeared in the car. And once again, she took the microphone and gave a speech. And it wasn't about New Year's greetings, of course. She was railing against the ungrateful behavior of the poor. Chris threw his weapon at her. Luckily, his assistant was able to block the attack. Mason didn't get angry this time, but pulled out his binoculars. At this time, the masked warriors also put on the night market mirror. Then the lights in the car went out. Before Chris could react, the train entered a tunnel. The train was in total darkness. With the help of night vision goggles, the masked warriors started killing. The poor people were blinded and killed. The resistance was about to be wiped out. At that moment, Chris remembered the child who collected matches. The child was like a messenger from God, to bring light to mankind. When the torches arrived, the tide of battle was turned. The poor men fought back with a vengeance. The brave Gray not only killed the conductor, but hit Mason with his flying dagger as he tried to escape. Chris rushed in Mason's direction, but then there was a familiar voice behind him. AI was being held at the neck with a knife. Chris was at a loss for words, but after a moment's hesitation, he chose to grab Mason. AI died at the hands of the enemy. As the train emerged from the tunnel, under the threat of Chris, Mason had to order the men to stop fighting. Although they had taken control of the water train, but Chris lost a good brother. In fact, he'd always felt guilty about M. When he first got on the train, people ate each other out of hunger, and Chris knew the taste of human flesh for the first time. To avoid being killed, a woman hid her baby, but Chris killed the woman and found the baby. And that's when Gillum stepped in. He cut off his own arm in exchange for the child's life, and the child that survived was M. And since then, Chris has been on a life of redemption. He took control of Mason. He thought he could force Dr. Weir to negotiate, but instead, Mason told them that this car was just a water station in the middle of the train. The real water supply comes from the front of the train. The perpetual motion machine breaks down the snow and ice outside. Dr. Weir himself is managing it. Chris was furious. He pulled out a knife and tried to kill Mason. To stay alive, Mason agreed to take them to the front of the car and would provide a safe passage. Gillum objected. He thought Mason was lying, that there was a huge trap up ahead, but Chris said there was no turning back. The only way to end this is to kill Dr. Weir, to put an end to all of this. And once he takes control of the train, he'll make Gilliam the new leader, to create a new order of social equality. When Chris made up his mind, Gillum didn't try to stop him. He just reminded him not to let Will talk when he saw him. Of course, Chris didn't trust Mason. In order to preserve his strength, he told Gillum and the refugees to stay back and recuperate. He took only 5 men with Mason to the front of the car, with Mason leading the way. With Mason at the helm, the journey was much easier. No one came out to stop them, and the rest of the train was an eye-opening experience. They first passed a greenhouse, where all kinds of green plants are cultivated. The fragrance of the earth is everywhere. There are people in charge of picking fresh fruits and vegetables, to provide the rich people in the front end with enough nutrients. Then they went to an oceanarium car. The creatures here are also for the rich. Mason warmly invited them to eat sushi. Seeing that the atmosphere was beginning to ease, she reveals the rules of ocean management. The fish ponds here are a closed ecosystem. Each individual must be connected. Mason's words were profound, but Chris wasn't buying it. He pulled out an egg white nugget to give her a taste of what it's like to be a bottom feeder. After passing through the refrigerated car, which was used for storing meat, they came to the school bus. It was filled with the children of the rich in the front end. The black mother and Angelo, who had lost their children, rushed forward to look for them, but they found nothing. In this car, a pregnant teacher was teaching a class. The lesson is a glorification of Will, the ruler. Apparently, the students have been brainwashed into thinking they're stupid. Next, the teacher tells the students to look out the window. There are the infamous frozen 7. 15 years ago, 7 men tried to escape when the train stopped. They ended up frozen alive. That's why it's important to recognize Will's faith. Without him, there's no security. At that moment, a bald man brought in eggs boiled in the engine's hot water. It was a gift to be delivered to each compartment. As they passed the teacher, the bald man gave him a basket of eggs, with a soothing music playing. The whole train seemed to be filled with warmth and joy. Chris pondered over the eggs given to him by the bald man, but all this was just a superficial harmony. The next moment, the bald man pulls a submachine gun out of the car and started shooting at the poor people. Then the masked soldiers were all rescued. The poor people could only scramble to the back of the car. At the same time, Chris and the others were were attacked in the school bus. Anglo was killed on the spot by a female teacher, but Gray was there in the nick of time. Gray was able to kill the teacher with a flying dagger. In the chaos, Mason tried to fight back, but Chris kicked him to the ground and subdued him. On the other hand, Gilliam was also a target. He was grabbed by a man. Then he shot Gilliam to death in front of the camera. Seeing this scene, Chris's faith completely collapsed. Subconsciously, he wanted to go back to take revenge. Luckily, his black mom woke him up with a slap on the wrist. Now he's the leader of the group, so he had to pick himself up and lead them on. Chris realized what his mission was. He picked up his weapon on the ground. He picked up his weapon and killed the worthless Mason without hesitation. The group began to accelerate towards the front of the car. Soon they arrived at the upper-class compartment. The rich are enjoying a life of extreme luxury. Obviously, people who only know how to enjoy themselves are not capable of fighting, so Chris ignored it. But the crisis wasn't over. One of the fighters took advantage of a turn in the train. He shot at Chris wildly. On the other side, Namgung Myeon-soo was fascinated by the snowflakes drifting into the train. No one knows what he is thinking at this moment. Gray's side is very agile, but after taking out 2 soldiers, he was still held down by the fighters. He died under the knife. The black mom was not spared either. She was shot in the stomach and fell down. Then Chris and the assailant fought together. At the crucial moment, Namgung Myeon-soo subdued the assailant from the shadows. It turns out that he is an expert in hiding. While the two were in a stalemate, Yuna was ready to take the blame, but she was stopped by Namgung Myeon-soo. He was determined not to let his daughter kill. Because it would be a nightmare for her. On her deathbed, the black mom pulled out a portrait of her son. She begged Chris to save her son. After she said that, she didn't breathe again. With the wishes of the people, Chris and Namgung Myeon-soo continued to the front of the car. When they passed a smoke-filled carriage, they realized that people were smoking Klonopin. This made the two of them very excited. They rushed forward to grab it. Not only that, the two also took enough fur coats. These coats will come in handy in the near future. After passing through 2 control carriages, they finally reached the front of the train, but it was hard to break in here. Namgung Myeon-soo was reluctant to open the door. He said he had been watching the window every year. Noticed that the snowflakes became thinner and thinner. The snow on the wreckage of the airplane is also melting gradually. This means that the temperature outside is constantly rising. Humans don't really need to live on this train at all. And the reason why Namgung Myeon-soo wanted a large amount of Kronol. He is not a drug addict, because Klonopin is a highly flammable and explosive chemical. As long as enough Klonopin is pinched together, it can be used as an explosive to blow up the side door. All you have to do is blow up the train. If you go out there in your fur coat, you're guaranteed to survive. But Chris didn't believe Namgung Myeon-soo. He thought he must be hallucinating from the Kronol. While they were arguing, the hatch in the front of the car suddenly opened. A fat woman shot Namgung Myeon-soo with a gun. Then she took Chris into the front of the car alone. Chris finally met the legendary Dr. Will. At that moment, Will was frying a steak in a calm manner. Because he has a lot of confidence, he could bring this rebel down by telling him the truth about the train. He and Gilliam had known each other for a long time, and everything they'd done had been planned by the two of them. Although the train can stay on the tracks forever, but there's a limit to the resources inside the train. To keep the human race alive longer, we must maintain a balance between population and food. And the best way to control the population is to create a riot. That's why Dr. Weir and Gilliam agreed years ago. Every 4 years, Gilliam would start a riot. The refugees at the end of the line clash with the soldiers at the front, so that the population can be quickly reduced, including Chris's rebellion. It's been in their plans for a long time, and Gilliam's so-called inside man was actually Will. Then Will brought Chris to the perpetual motion machine. He said that he was very old. He wanted Chris to stay here, to help him manage the people on the train. When he heard the truth, Chris was confused. He didn't know who to trust. At that moment, outside the door of the train, the assailant was not dead. He led a group of rich people to the front of the train. The injured Namgung Myeon-soo tried his best to stop them from coming in. He asked his daughter Yuna to get matches from Chris to light the explosives, but when Yuna ran by, Chris pushed her away. Apparently, Chris was brainwashed by Will and lost his mind. That's when Una suddenly sensed someone under the floorboards. She rushed to pry open the floor tiles. She saw a little boy doing the same thing over and over again under the gears. It was the black mom's son. It turns out that the perpetual motion machine is not eternal. Some of the parts have been damaged in the course of operation, so someone has to replace them, and the space below can only accommodate children under 5 years old. This scene snapped Chris out of his daze. He punched Will and knocked him to the ground. Then he stuck his arm in the gears. He managed to get the boy out. At that moment, Anglo's son stepped out of the machine. The boy walked into the equipment room with a blank look on his face. On the other side, Yuna, who had the matches, ran towards the door. She lights the chrono that stuck to the side door, but when they were about to hide in the front of the car, they realized that the motor of the hatch was damaged. At this moment, Chris and Namgung Myeon-soo realized they had to keep the children alive. The two held Yuna and the boy tightly in their arms. With a loud bang, the train was blown through a big hole, but the explosion triggered an avalanche outside. The train, deprived of power, falls off the tracks. The train cars were torn apart by the snow. When Yuna woke up again, she and the boy were the only ones who had survived. They climbed out of the train wreckage. They breathed the outside air for the first time, only to see a polar bear walking on top of the mountain in the distance. It seems that Nangong Myung-soo's guess was correct. The Earth's ecology is slowly recovering. If animals can survive, then human beings must be able to do the same. But can Yuna and the boy survive alone? How can they rebuild human civilization in the icy ruins? It still seems hopeless. Perhaps we can only pray for another miracle. And that's the end of the movie. Snow Train was released in 2013, directed by Korean director Bang Joon-ho. The screenplay is based on the French sci-fi comic book of the same name. The movie cost a whopping $40 billion. As a post-apocalyptic disaster movie, the director didn't focus too much on the scenes. It's more like a political metaphor in the guise of science fiction. The class oppression and resistance in human society since ancient times is condensed into a perpetually moving train, and the reason why the train finally stops with the near extinction of human beings. This is the director's expression of helplessness and sadness about the current state of society. When the two children finally get out of the wrecked carriages, when the two children finally step out of the wrecked car and leave the first footprints on the snow-covered ground, a brand new social system can really be opened. Reality is often more brutal than movies. This is the end of today's story. Thank you for your support. I look forward to seeing you again.